What happens when one woman, silenced by power, decides to fight back? Vivien Sinclair didn't just challenge the system, she set it on fire. But when the very people sworn to protect the law turn against her, will the truth be enough to bring justice? In a fight where nothing is certain, one thing is clear: the battle for what's right has only just begun. Racist cop confronts mysterious black woman. What happens next shocks everyone. The sun cast a golden glow over the city streets that afternoon, bustling with life. In a quiet corner, however, a woman sat alone, her posture serene, her eyes lost in thought. Vivien Sinclair, a black billionaire known to few outside the corporate world, had chosen this anonymity deliberately. Dressed in casual attire, she blended effortlessly into her surroundings, exactly as she preferred. Her journey to this point had been far from easy. From a gritty upbringing in an unforgiving neighborhood to becoming a self-made titan of industry, Vivien had seen and endured it all. Moments like this, a pause from her relentless pace, were her rare sanctuaries. But peace was fleeting. The sound of heavy boots striking pavement echoed through the empty street, each step louder than the last. Vivien's eyes instinctively shifted toward the sound. A tall, imposing figure approached, Officer Walker, a man infamous in the community for his volatile temper and unchecked authority. "You think you can just sit here?" Walker barked, his tone both mocking and threatening. His eyes swept over Vivien, narrowing in thinly veiled contempt. Vivien didn't flinch. Years of fighting to prove her worth had taught her the value of composure, even in the face of hostility. "I'm not disturbing anyone," she replied evenly, her voice calm but firm. Walker smirked, leaning slightly forward, his posture oozing intimidation. "People like you don't belong in neighborhoods like this. You're making the place look bad." Anger simmered under Vivien's composed exterior, but she kept it contained. She had faced worse. "I have every right to be here," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving his. Walker's expression darkened, his frustration mounting. "Think you're clever, don't you?" he sneered, stepping closer. His hand hovered near his belt, a subtle but deliberate show of power. "Maybe I should teach you a lesson about respect?" Unbeknownst to Walker, a black SUV had slowed to a stop nearby. The tinted windows concealed its passengers, but one of them, a man in an impeccably tailored suit, was watching closely. He had been following Vivien's journey for years, waiting for the right moment to step in. Walker's hand moved toward Vivien's shoulder, his intent unmistakable. But before he could make contact, the SUV door swung open. The suited man stepped out, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Officer Walker," he called, his voice calm but laced with authority. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" The color drained from Walker's face as recognition dawned. The man was none other than Charles Whitaker, a high-profile civil rights attorney with a reputation for dismantling corrupt systems. "Step away from her," Whitaker ordered, his piercing gaze locking onto Walker. "Or I'll make sure your name headlines every major news outlet by tomorrow morning." Vivien, still seated, met Whitaker's eyes with a faint smile. The moment had shifted entirely, but the consequences of Walker's actions were only beginning to unfold. The world was about to learn not only who Vivien truly was but also the injustices she had quietly endured and fought to overcome. The tension was suffocating as Officer Walker leaned closer, his voice sharp and menacing. "Maybe I should teach you a lesson about respecting the law," he sneered. Vivien's heart pounded, but her gaze remained steady, defiant. She had faced many challenges, but this, being threatened by an abusive officer in plain view, was a new kind of danger. Walker stepped closer, his expression dark and full of contempt. "Stand up," he barked, his hand brushing his gun belt as if daring her to defy him. His eyes swept the deserted street, confirming they were alone. "I'm not breaking any law," Vivien replied, her voice calm and steady, though a storm brewed inside her. She stayed seated, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. Walker smirked, his tone dripping with mockery. "Who do you think you are?" he hissed. "You think you're untouchable? Anyone can be dragged in if I say so." Vivien's silence only enraged him further. He lunged forward, shoving her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble. She quickly regained her balance, her eyes blazing with anger, but she didn't back down. "You have no right to touch me," she said, her voice low but firm, each word carrying weight. Walker's jaw tightened. He grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her to her feet. "There's no one here to protect you," he hissed, his voice filled with malice. "I am the law." Pain shot through her arm, but Vivien refused to show weakness. She stared him down, her resolve unbroken. The tension was unbearable, and for a moment, it seemed like Walker's abuse would escalate further. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp, commanding voice cut through the silence. "Let her go." Now, Walker froze, spinning around to see a tall man standing just feet away. His calm, authoritative tone carried a quiet power. "I saw everything," the man said, holding up a phone with its camera recording. "And so will the world." Walker's face paled, his grip loosening. The tables had turned, and he knew it. While still gripping Vivien's arm, Walker's smirk wavered as Daniel's voice cut through with quiet strength. "You're abusing your authority," Daniel said, his gaze locking onto Walker's with a mix of empathy and resolve. It was a silent promise to Vivien. She wouldn't face this alone. Walker sneered, his lips twisting into a forced smile. "It's just a misunderstanding, sir. I'd advise you not to interfere in police matters, unless you want trouble." His grip remained firm on Vivien's arm, but tension flickered in his posture. Daniel didn't back down. "If standing up for her rights means trouble, I'll face it," he said, his tone sharp and unyielding. "But let me be clear, this abuse of power won't go unanswered." Vivien felt Walker's grip loosen slightly, though the air remained charged with hostility. Her eyes shifted to Daniel, and for the first time, a flicker of relief broke through her fear. She wasn't alone anymore. Walker's jaw clenched as his forced composure cracked. "I'll remember this," he said through gritted teeth, his eyes flashing with restrained anger. He released Vivien's arm, taking a step back but not before delivering a cold, warning glare. "But don't think this is over. Next time, no one will be around to protect you." Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself between Walker and Vivien. His stance was firm, radiating unwavering defense. "We'll see who needs protection, Officer Walker," he replied, his voice steady. Walker hesitated before retreating, his footsteps heavy as he marched back to his patrol car. He cast one last icy glance over his shoulder before slamming the door and driving away. Vivien let out a slow breath, the tension in her body easing as she turned to Daniel. Her voice, though soft, carried sincerity. "Thank you," she said, her gaze steady but filled with gratitude. Daniel's expression softened as he nodded. "I couldn't stand by and watch that happen. But this isn't over. We need to make sure he's held accountable." Vivien stood silently for a moment, the echoes of the confrontation still lingering in her mind. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, silently reminding her she wasn't alone in the fight ahead. Their relief was short-lived. Another patrol car pulled up, its flashing red and blue lights casting harsh shadows across the street. Two officers stepped out, their expressions cold and resolute. "We need you to come with us," one officer said, his tone void of emotion. Daniel opened his mouth to object, but Vivien gently shook her head, her gaze firm and unyielding. She understood what was coming and knew she needed to stay composed. "Don't worry," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm within. "I'll be fine." Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes a mix of worry and determination. "I'll call a lawyer immediately. Don't let them push you around." Vivien nodded, her resolve growing stronger as the officers stepped closer. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. Vivien gave Daniel a small, reassuring smile as she stepped into the patrol car. The cold metal seat pressed against her, a stark reminder of the harsh reality she was entering. As the car moved through the city, the flickering streetlights cast fleeting shadows across her face. Her expression was calm, her eyes reflecting not fear but steely determination. When they arrived at the station, the slam of the car door echoed sharply in the still air. She was led inside, the fluorescent lights overhead casting an unflattering glare on the drab walls. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled her nose, and the faint sounds of laughter and clicking keyboards filtered in from outside. Inside the interrogation room, silence enveloped her. Vivien sat on the cold metal chair, her hands lightly resting on the table as adrenaline coursed through her veins. She took a deep breath, grounding herself. Memories of her past flashed through her mind: hardship, perseverance, and victories against all odds. Those moments had shaped her and now gave her strength to face this ordeal. The door creaked open, breaking the silence. Walker entered, his cold smile carrying an air of arrogance. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers with a look of disdain. "You think someone standing up for you changes anything?" He sneered, his voice low and biting. "You think you've won?" Vivien met his gaze without flinching, her voice calm and deliberate. "I don't think I've won," she said, each word carrying weight. "But I know this is far from over." Walker's smile faded, his expression hardening as tension filled the room. He leaned closer for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Then, as if retreating from an invisible force, he stepped back, his movements stiff with frustration. "You'll see who really holds the power," he said coldly before turning and slamming the door behind him. Left alone, Vivien sat in the heavy silence, her heartbeat steadying. Walker's threats lingered in her mind, but they no longer shook her. Instead, they fueled her resolve. The ticking clock on the wall marked each second as she gathered her thoughts. This wasn't her first battle, and it wouldn't be her last. The fire within her burned brighter now, a reminder that she wasn't just fighting for herself but for everyone silenced by injustice. Against Walker, but against the system that allowed such abuse to persist. The atmosphere in the room shifted, no longer weighed down by fear but charged with determination and purpose. Sandra stood, closing her briefcase with a decisive snap. "I'll draft the lawsuit tonight. By morning, the world will know your story, Vivien." Daniel leaned closer to Vivien, his voice soft but firm. "You're not alone in this. We'll stand with you every step of the way." Vivien nodded, a faint smile gracing her lips. Her exhaustion began to fade, replaced by the fire of resolve. "This isn't just my fight," she said, her voice steady and filled with purpose. "It's for everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been told they don't matter. This ends now." Sandra reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Vivien's shoulder. "Then let's make sure they hear you loud and clear." The three of them exchanged determined glances. The ticking clock on the wall seemed to slow, marking the beginning of a long but necessary journey toward justice. Needed. Daniel stood nearby, his reassuring nod silently encouraging Vivien to stay strong. As the room quieted, Vivien gripped the edges of the podium, her resolve unwavering despite the chaos around her. She scanned the room, meeting the eyes of reporters waiting to pounce on her every word. "Good afternoon," Vivien began, her voice calm yet commanding. "I stand here today not just for myself but for everyone who has ever been mistreated, silenced, or judged unfairly." The flashes intensified as she spoke, her words echoing through the packed room. "What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger, systemic issue, one that has gone unchallenged for too long. This is about accountability, justice, and the right for everyone, regardless of who they are, to live free from fear and prejudice." Reporters raised their hands, eager to ask questions. One stood and asked pointedly, "Some critics say you're using your wealth and status to gain attention. How do you respond to those accusations?" Vivien didn't flinch. Wealth doesn't protect anyone from injustice. If anything, it highlights how deeply rooted these problems are. "I'm using my platform to shed light on an issue many face but can't fight back against. This isn't about me, it's about creating change." Another voice chimed in. "Do you believe Officer Walker is solely to blame, or is the problem bigger than one individual?" Vivien took a deep breath before responding. "Walker's actions are a symptom of a system that allows abuse to thrive. This fight isn't just about him, it's about holding the entire system accountable." As she spoke, Sandra and Daniel exchanged glances, their pride evident. Vivien's words carried weight, resonating deeply with many in the room. When the conference ended, the reporters erupted with follow-up questions, but Vivien stepped away, her statement made. Backstage, Sandra placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did exactly what needed to be done." Daniel added, "They're listening. This is only the beginning, but it's a strong start." Vivien nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. The battle ahead was daunting, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, she believed the tide was beginning to turn. Myself in the mirror again. His voice trembled slightly, but his resolve was clear. Vivien felt a surge of gratitude mixed with disbelief. She hadn't expected this kind of support, especially from someone within the very system that had oppressed her. Her voice softened, but it was still strong. "Thank you, Officer Grant. It takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing. I won't forget it." Grant nodded, his expression earnest. "I just want to make it right, Miss Sinclair." Sandra, who had been silently observing the exchange, spoke up. "We'll need you to go on record with this. We'll help you navigate the process, but this is a crucial part of the case." Grant hesitated, then nodded again. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. We can't let people like Walker get away with it." Vivien's heart swelled with a mix of emotion. This was the moment she had been hoping for, the realization that not all systems were beyond repair, and that even those within them could find the courage to stand up. "Let's make sure his actions are brought to light," Vivien said, her voice resolute. "This fight is far from over, but it's a fight I'll win, and now I know I won't be fighting alone." With Grant's confirmation to testify, Vivien felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about confronting Walker anymore. It was about restoring trust in the system. It was about proving that change was possible, even in the most entrenched places. As they walked out of the lobby, the weight of the upcoming battle still looming over them, Daniel placed a hand on Vivien's shoulder. "You're not just standing for yourself, Viv. You're standing for everyone who's been silenced, for everyone who's been hurt." Vivien nodded, a small, determined smile forming. "I know. And I won't stop until the truth comes out. For all of us." Together, they left the building, ready to face the next chapter of their fight. The road ahead would be long, but Vivien was no longer the woman who had once been afraid to speak out. She was a force, and she was ready to make sure the world knew the truth. The judge entered, and the room fell silent, all eyes turning to the front as the gavel slammed down. "This court is now in session," the judge said, his voice authoritative yet calm. Vivien could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she held herself steady, focused on the truth. Her heart raced, but she wasn't afraid. She was ready. Ready to face Walker, ready to face the system that had allowed men like him to abuse their power for too long. She glanced at Sandra, who gave her a reassuring nod, before looking back at the defense table where Walker sat, trying to maintain a stoic expression. The prosecutor began the proceedings, presenting the evidence, which now included Grant's testimony. His statement about Walker's abusive actions over the years, along with his willingness to testify, was crucial. The prosecutor laid out the timeline of events, beginning with Walker's confrontation with Vivien outside the store and continuing through her wrongful detention at the police station. Vivien could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her as the details of her ordeal were shared. Her anger began to rise again, but she controlled it, channeling her emotions into a quiet, resolute strength. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered at the hands of those who were supposed to protect and serve. As the prosecutor finished, it was time for the defense. Walker's attorney stood, and with practiced calm, he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense will show that this is nothing more than a misunderstanding. Officer Walker was simply doing his job, responding to what he believed was a potential threat." The lawyer's tone was smooth, confident, but Vivien could hear the desperation behind it. He was trying to paint a picture of Walker as a man of duty, not the abuser he truly was. The defense lawyer turned toward Vivien. "Miss Sinclair," he began, his voice sharp, "are you sure you weren't exaggerating the situation? Are you sure you didn't provoke Officer Walker in some way?" Vivien's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady. "I didn't provoke anything. I was doing nothing more than sitting on the steps, minding my own business. Officer Walker chose to approach me with aggression, and I did nothing to deserve that." Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of everything she had been through, every injustice she had endured. The defense attorney pressed on, but Vivien stood firm, unyielding. Every question, every attempt to undermine her would only make her resolve stronger. She had prepared for this moment, and she would not back down. After what felt like hours, the defense rested. The room was thick with tension as the judge called for a short recess before the closing arguments. Vivien sat back in her chair, her body weary but her spirit unbroken. Sandra placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "You did well, Vivien," she said quietly. Daniel leaned in, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We're closer than ever to winning this, Viv. You're amazing." Vivien nodded, grateful for their unwavering support. But she knew that the real battle wasn't over yet. The closing arguments would come next, and she needed to stay focused, stay strong. The world was watching. As the recess ended and everyone returned to their seats, Vivien stood, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her like a cloak. The closing arguments would be her final chance to speak. She would tell her truth, and she would not be silenced. This fight was hers, but it was also for everyone who had suffered under the abuse of power. For everyone who had ever been denied justice. With one last deep breath, she walked toward the podium, ready to make her closing statement. Ready to take a stand not just for herself, but for all who had been wronged. The time for silence was over. It was time for the truth to be heard. Her silent nods of encouragement as she took her seat. The courtroom was packed, and the air was thick with anticipation. Every eye was on Vivien as she sat quietly, gathering her thoughts, knowing that the coming hours would be crucial. As the second day of the trial began, Sandra rose and walked to the podium, her steps measured and confident. The defense attorneys had tried to muddy the waters on the first day, but now it was time to bring the case back into focus. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sandra began, her voice steady and commanding, "today we are not only presenting evidence of one officer's abuse of power. We are exposing a system that has failed to protect those it is meant to serve. Vivien Sinclair is here today because she was wronged, but she is not alone. There are countless others who suffer in silence, afraid to speak up, afraid of the consequences. This case is about giving them a voice. It's about showing the world that accountability is not optional, it is necessary." Her words echoed in the quiet courtroom, and Vivien felt the weight of them settling in her chest. This wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who had ever felt powerless, marginalized, and silenced. She had become the face of something much larger than herself. After a brief pause, Sandra continued, "Officer Walker used his position to intimidate, manipulate, and harm. He thought he could do so without consequence. But today, we prove him wrong." Sandra turned, then called Vivien to the stand. The room held its breath as Vivien stood, her legs steady beneath her, her heart a mixture of nerves and determination. She walked to the witness box, her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to let anything shake her resolve. When she sat down, Sandra began the questioning, her tone soft yet firm, allowing Vivien the space to speak freely. "Vivien," Sandra asked, her voice carrying the weight of the room, "tell the jury what happened that day, the day Officer Walker approached you." Vivien took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to the moment. "I was sitting on the steps, minding my own business, when he approached. He didn't ask any questions, didn't try to understand the situation. He immediately assumed something was wrong with me. And when I didn't respond the way he wanted, he used his position to force me to comply." Her voice faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "He was intimidating and I was scared. But I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to exist, and he treated me as if I didn't matter." The room was silent as Vivien spoke, and even the judge seemed to consider her words carefully. Sandra nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Tell them what happened after that." Vivien nodded and described in detail how Walker had escalated the situation, dragging her to the station, all while belittling her and refusing to listen. She didn't leave out a single detail, even though it was painful to relive. She knew this was necessary, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been unjustly treated. When she finished, there was a heavy silence, the kind that only came after the truth was laid bare. Vivien felt a sense of exhaustion settle over her, but she also felt stronger than she ever had before. The defense stood to cross-examine her, but their questions felt weak in comparison to the strength of Vivien's testimony. They tried to discredit her, to make her doubt herself, but it didn't work. She stood firm, unwavering in her belief that she was doing the right thing. As the day wore on, the courtroom drama intensified. Walker's defense attorneys continued to try to twist the narrative, but each time they attempted to steer the conversation away from Walker's behavior, Sandra expertly guided it back to the central issue: abuse of power and the harm it caused to individuals like Vivien. At the end of the second day, Vivien felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. They were getting closer. Tomorrow, the jury would begin deliberations, and the tension in the room was palpable. As Vivien walked out of the courtroom, she found herself surrounded by reporters, their cameras flashing, their voices blending together in a chaotic chorus. She felt the weight of their questions, their expectations, but she remained calm. Daniel and Sandra were by her side, offering their quiet support as they made their way out of the building. For the first time in a long while, Vivien felt a sense of peace in knowing that she had done everything she could. She had spoken the truth, and now it was up to the jury to decide if the system would stand with her or against her. As they walked out into the cool evening air, the tension of the trial still lingered, but Vivien felt a new sense of strength. No matter the outcome, she had already won. She had faced her fear, stood up against injustice, and shown the world that one voice, one person, could make a difference. And that, she realized, was just the beginning. Breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She glanced around at the sea of faces, each one reflecting hope, admiration, and the weight of the victory they had all fought for together. The flashing cameras, the voices calling her name, it was overwhelming, yet it also felt like a vindication of everything she had endured. She cleared her throat, the microphone in front of her, her heart pounding with the realization that her words could inspire change. "Today is not just a victory for me," Vivien began, her voice steady and clear. "It's a victory for everyone who has been silenced, ignored, or oppressed. It's a reminder that no one is above the law, and that the truth has a power that cannot be denied." Her gaze swept over the crowd, her expression resolute but filled with empathy. This case, this moment, is for all those who have faced injustice and felt powerless. This victory belongs to them too. It's proof that when we stand together and refuse to stay silent, we can make the system work for us, not against us. The crowd erupted in applause once more, the sound swelling like a wave. Vivien could feel the energy shift around her, as if her words had ignited something deep within everyone who had gathered there. As she stepped away from the microphone, Sandra, Daniel, and the rest of her team stood beside her, their presence a testament to the hard work and determination that had brought them all to this point. They had been through the fire together, and now they were seeing the fruits of their labor. But Vivien knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. "We did it," Daniel said softly, a proud smile on his face as he looked at Vivien. She nodded, her heart full of gratitude for the people who had been with her every step of the way. "We did," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but with a sense of conviction that was unshakable. As they walked toward the car, the cheers of the crowd faded into the background, but Vivien felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there would be many more challenges to face. But for the first time in a long while, she felt truly hopeful that justice could prevail, and that her fight had made a difference. Vivien Sinclair had not only challenged the system, she had changed it. Vivien took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She looked around at the sea of faces, hope, admiration, and the victory they had fought for reflected in their eyes. The flashing cameras and voices calling her name were overwhelming, yet they felt like a vindication of everything she had endured. With a steady voice, she addressed the crowd, "Today is not just a victory for me, but for everyone silenced, ignored, or oppressed. It's a reminder that no one is above the law, and that truth has a power that can't be denied." Her gaze swept over the crowd, filled with resolve. This victory belongs to all who have faced injustice. It's proof that when we stand together and refuse to stay silent, we can make the system work for us, not against us. The crowd erupted in applause, and Vivien felt the energy shift. As she stepped away from the microphone, Sandra, Daniel, and her team stood by her, proof of the hard work that had brought them to this point. But Vivien knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. "We did it," Daniel said softly, his pride clear. Vivien nodded, her voice filled with gratitude. "We did." As they walked to the car, the cheers faded, but Vivien felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, and more challenges would come. But for the first time in a long while, she felt truly hopeful that justice could prevail and that her fight had made a difference. Vivien Sinclair had not just challenged the system, she had changed it. Vivien Sinclair's journey was not just about fighting for herself but for every person who had been silenced, for those whose voices had been ignored or dismissed by a system that failed them. Today, she stood as proof that courage, resilience, and the truth could overcome the darkest of injustices. But the fight wasn't over. This victory, while monumental, was only the beginning. The work to create a world where justice prevails for all was just starting, and Vivien was ready to continue the fight. If you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, if you've been inspired by Vivien's courage, don't let her story end here. Share it with others, spread the message, and together, let's make sure that injustice is never overlooked again. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, resilience, and the power of justice. Keep standing for what's right, because the world needs more voices like Vivien's.